What if I told you that the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't some random historical accident? It was actually a textbook example of how superpowers unravel. And here's what's wild. The mechanics that brought down one of the world's greatest powers are the same patterns we see in every major collapse throughout history. Understanding how the Soviet system fell apart isn't just about history. It's about recognizing the warning signs before empires crumble. Let me break down exactly what happened and why it matters to you. The Cold War gave us the perfect blueprint for understanding systemic collapse around the world. Think about it this way. The Soviet Union wasn't conquered by a military invasion. It didn't lose a decisive battle. Instead, it crumbled from the inside out, strangled by its own contradictions. And that's the pattern we need to understand. The system had three major failure points, and they all fed into each other. We saw it as it happened. First, there was economic strain. The Soviet economy was built on a centrally planned model that worked in the 1950s and 1960s. But by the 1980s, it was completely outdated. The government was spending between 15 and 17% of their GDP on military expenses. They were trying to match American defense spending, while their civilian economy was falling apart. Consumer goods were scarce. People were waiting in lines for basic supplies. The technology gap between Soviet and Western economies kept growing wider. You can't sustain a superpower when your people can't even buy quality food or clothing. The system was burning resources faster than it could generate them. And here's where it gets interesting. That economic pressure created the second failure point, political fragmentation. When the economy weakens, people lose faith in the system. Mikhail Gorbachev tried to fix things with glasnost, which meant openness, and perestroika, which meant restructuring. But those policies actually accelerated the collapse instead of preventing it. See, once you allow people to speak freely, they start questioning everything. Regional leaders began demanding independence. Different Soviet republics wanted out. The Communist Party's grip on power started slipping. You had competing visions for what the Soviet Union should become, and nobody could agree. That political division meant the center couldn't hold. Different factions were pulling in different directions. The authority of Moscow weakened, and when central authority weakens, everything falls apart faster. Here's something counterintuitive that most people get wrong. You'd think that the Soviet collapse happened suddenly, right? Like it was one dramatic moment in 1991. But the reality is much more instructive. The seeds were planted decades earlier. When Gorbachev took power, the Soviet system was already hemorrhaging. Real wages for Soviet workers had actually declined in the early 1980s. There was a shortage of basic consumer items that lasted for years. But the government kept telling people everything was fine. They kept claiming the system was working. This gap between what leaders said and what people experienced was absolutely critical. It destroyed trust in a way that's hard to recover from. When people stop believing what their government tells them, the whole legitimacy of the system collapses. And that's exactly what happened. By 1989, public opinion polls showed that less than 20% of Soviet citizens believed the Communist Party could fix their problems. That's a stunning number. Less than 1 in 5 people had faith in the system they were living under. You can't run a superpower on that kind of foundation. The third failure point was external pressure. The United States, under Ronald Reagan, ramped up military spending and challenged Soviet influence everywhere. Afghanistan became a costly quagmire for Soviet forces. They were bleeding resources and soldiers in a war they couldn't win. The Soviet invasion in December 1979 turned into a decade-long disaster. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. The economic cost was enormous. Meanwhile, the American economy was growing stronger. Western Europe was becoming more prosperous and more united. The Soviet model looked worse and worse by comparison. People could see that the Western system was producing better results. That gap between promise and reality is devastating to any regime. So here's what I want you to understand right now. These three forces didn't work in isolation. They created a feedback loop. Economic problems made people lose faith. Loss of faith created political instability. Political instability made economic problems worse. External pressure exploited all these weaknesses. By 1991, the whole structure collapsed. But here's the motivational part that most people miss. Understanding this pattern gives you power. When you see these mechanics at work in any system, you can predict what's coming. You can prepare accordingly. You can recognize when a structure is becoming fragile. Maybe it's a company, a government, or even a relationship. The patterns are the same. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to explore more collapse patterns in upcoming videos. And click the next video to see how these same mechanics played out in other fallen empires.